Welcome to tonight's event, Astonished by Love, Storytelling and Sacramental Imagination. We're honored to have Alice McDermott again at Boston College. I recall well her last C21 talk in 2005, entitled Why Women Choose to Stay. You see an article on your seat, and that came out of that talk for the BC Magazine. And just to share, I remember passing that article along to my mom back in 2005. So it's a wonderful reflection. My name is Eric Goldschmidt. I'm the director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and I have the privilege of welcoming all of you to campus this evening. I also want to welcome our online viewers. And most especially, I'm honored to welcome Alice McDermott as a speaker in our semester series on intimacy and relationships in Catholic life. This event is co-sponsored by the Boston College English Department. This evening, Alice McDermott will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll then hear your questions and your comments. And then is gracious and willing to meet afterwards to sign some books. You may have seen we have several of her books on sale. Before we begin, I'm honored also to introduce her to our speaker, our distinguished poet and Professor Paul Mariani from the English Department will formally introduce Alice. Paul.
Good evening. When I had the honor of introducing Alice McDermott here at Boston College 11 years ago, I noted that she had written 5 novels over the past 20 years, the longest just over 250 pages. These were, in the order of publication, The Bigamist's Daughter, which she published in 1982 when she was not yet 30, followed by That Night, 5 years later, a finalist for the Pulitzer and the National Book Award. That, in turn, was followed by At Weddings and Wakes 5 years later, and then 6 years later, in 1998, by Charming Billy, which won the National Book Award, and then in 2002, Child of My Heart. In 2006, she published After This, and then just this past fall, her 7th novel, Someone. All but the first were published by Farrar Straus and Giroux. 7 novels, each one more exquisite and heartbreaking than the last. Someone, about an Irish household in Brooklyn going back to the 1920s, is so deftly presented, one reviewer wrote, that even the damp shirts and the school blouses on the clothesline have some import. For the young girl, Marie, views them as hung upside down by their hems, their arms waving in a way that made me grow dizzy in sympathy. She's a rebel, this young girl, and she's going to do things her way, even if it means burning the loaf of bread her mother has asked to watch in the oven because Marie's father needs her. And then like that, the next day, her father is in the hospital, and Marie, after searching for the right window, finally sees him waving to her and her mother as if from behind the sky's reflection, from a place from which, it turns out, he will never return. Alice McDermott's world consists of Brooklyn and Queens and the vast reaches of Long Island, though she has written of those places mostly in exile, in San Diego and New Hampshire, and now the mother of 3 just outside Washington, D.C., where she lives with her husband, a neuroscientist, and teaches in the Johns Hopkins writing program. I love her fiction world for many reasons, not least because much of her world is mine and my wife's as well. And it's exhilarating to see that busy, jumbled, too often gray world transformed through her sacramental imagination. Yes, her sacramental imagination. For her, fiction is as much about texture as it is about narrative, about the way we remember and disremember. It is our fallen world, gone now, that she remembers, recording angel that she is, a world somehow miraculously restored, even as we realize that it is also gone forever. The attempt to recover what keeps disappearing over the horizon. This is what she shares with Virgil and Proust and Dickinson and Stevens and Hopkins and William Carlos Williams, who confessed the end that we come to watch time's flight as we might watch summer lightning or fireflies secure by grace of the imagination, safe in its care. By grace of the imagination. It's a phrase that musics more ways than one, as Alice McDermott's work so subtly and so profoundly shows, where the recording angels of history are always present, just off stage, revealing the quotidian in the golden luminosity we, like children, seem to be intent on stripping from it, but which the necessary angel of the imagination gracefully, sacramentally restores. The present-day mentality, more perhaps than that of people in the past, seems opposed to a God of mercy. John Paul II wrote not so many years ago, "For ours is a time which seems to remove from the human heart the very idea of mercy, something we hunger for without realizing how much we need that mercy. Yes, we need justice, but we need mercy even more. And it is just there, in the shadow of God's mercy, that Alice McDermott offers us in her fiction an exquisite, comforting mercy like no other." Alice McDermott.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me here, and thank you for deflating your inflated expectations after that tremendous introduction. That was just beautiful. Thank you. I only wish I could begin to live up to it, but I so appreciate the encouragement to do so. Forgive me, I'm just going to read this little talk a bit, and this is a habit that I got into when my children were still at home. Before that, I could deliver a talk, more or less think about what I had to say, and write out a few note cards, and then deliver a talk. And then somehow having a household with 3 children disrupts your attention span in what I'm finding is a permanent way. So rather than stand here and about 10 minutes into this say, "What was I saying?" I thought I'd better write it down. So bear with me. As you know, our title tonight is Astonished by Love, Storytelling and the Sacramental Imagination. First, a disclaimer. The Irish novelist Colm Toibeen recently visited us at Johns Hopkins, where I teach, and in the course of his reading and discussion, he made the remark, somewhat offhandedly, that in the Catholic tradition of his childhood, there were plenty of prayers to the Father and the Son, and even more, it would seem, to the Son's mother, but very few to the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. The comment made me think that as a child, Colm Toybeen never worried about passing a test, because in my Catholic tradition, "Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love," was a prayer I repeated fervently before and often during every exam I ever took, most especially and most fervently if that exam involved numbers. I mentioned this to a graduate student friend who had been in the audience, which led her to ask me, quite simply, what the notion of the Trinity can possibly be about. The whole one God, three-person thing, she said, sounds a lot like three different gods, each with various superpowers. She said superpowers, not unlike multiple gods. She said, good-naturedly, it's kind of a word game, isn't it? Saying persons instead of small g, gods. I mean, how do you even think about it? Since it was an Irishman who had prompted the discussion, I was tempted to use the old St. Patrick standby. Consider the shamrock, I might have said. But the student was a talented fiction writer and an avid reader and an agnostic with no faith tradition of her own. So I found myself asking her instead to consider the way a novel happens. I said happens because I wasn't thinking about the way a novel is composed by the writer, nor did I mean the way the self-conscious reader assesses a work of fiction. I said happens because I was thinking of the way a novel happens to any one of us when we give ourselves over to it. I was thinking of the confluence that occurs when we read, confluence of the writer's mind, the narrator's mind, and the mind of the reader. It's a simple enough formula, although when you stop to think about it, miraculous in its simplicity. The writer, in the silence of her composing room, puts her mind, her language, her experience, her aspirations and observations, even her own will, at the service of the narrator. The narrator speaks and creates a world. The reader, in turn, lends his inner voice, the voice with which we speak to ourselves, to the narrator, and thus that created world comes into vivid existence. Eliminate one part of this particular trinity, and the novel, the story, the poem, literature itself disappears. Clearly, without the novelist, there is no novel. Without the narrator, even a narrator who greatly resembles the novelist, there is no created world, only a transcript or a polemic. Without the reader, that world remains nothing more than marks on a page or, worse yet, on a glowing screen with limited battery life. This particular 3-in-1 is not a matter of three separate entities with three sets of powers, superpowers or otherwise. This is a trinity that is absolutely necessary to the very existence of the novel. 3-in-1, I told my student, making this very point. For some of us, it's a holy trinity indeed. I use this little anecdote as a disclaimer in the face of the rather daunting task at hand, a discussion of storytelling and the sacramental imagination. I use it to illustrate first that I am no theologian, and second, that I have no theories or even thoughts worth sharing about anything that exists in the real world. That is, the world that is not dependent on that Holy Trinity, writer, narrator, reader, for its existence. My friend, the writer Tony Early, tells this story to the students in his fiction workshop. When he was a boy, his parents often rented a cottage in the mountains. One summer morning, he got up early and wandered outside to play. When some time had gone by and the cottage remained suspiciously quiet, he decided his parents were oversleeping, and with a child's wordless instincts, he felt it his duty to wake them. But when he tried to get back into the cottage, he found that his parents had locked the screen door. He rattled the door and called to them and was told by his muffled-voiced father to stay outside a little longer, which, of course, only made him more determined to get in. There followed an exchange well familiar to many amorous parents of small children. "Let me in. Just a minute. I want to come in. Give us a minute." Until little Tony, in his desperation, cried out, "There's a big snake out here." Moments later, his father appeared behind the screen. He opened the door and lifted a shovel that was resting against the house. "Where?" he asked Tony, and the boy pointed to a sandy lot near some trees. "Right over there," he said. Father and son began to walk toward the spot, scanning the ground. "How big?" his father asked. "Really big," Tony said. "What color?" his father asked. "Black," Tony said, "with stripes, yellow stripes." This seemed to impress his father tremendously, so little Tony added, "Red stripes, too." And because he was so delighted with the effect of his tale, not only had he gotten his father to open the screen door, he'd gotten him out of the house, armed with a shovel, and now the two were embarked on a great snake-hunting adventure. Tony then shouted, "And it has two big heads!" Of course, it was at this moment that his father stopped and looked down at his son and knew it was all a lie. Tony uses this story to illustrate for his writing students the difference between the right detail and the wrong detail. The detail that creates a fictional world and the detail that makes that world evaporate. But I like the anecdote for what it says about readers and writers. From the moment Tony said, "There's a snake out here," until the moment he mentioned the two heads, he and his father shared a vision. Both of them dwelled in a world where a snake was lying in the sandy area near the trees. Both of them saw that snake, held it in their mind's eye, and both of them, for those few seconds, shared a belief in its existence, acted together as if it existed. For those few moments, the truth of the matter, as well as Tony's motivation for the lie, not to mention his father's motivation for locking the screen door in the first place, became irrelevant. For those few moments, the snake was there. In his marvelous lectures on literature, Vladimir Nabokov writes, "Literature was born not the day when a boy crying 'Wolf, wolf, wolf' came running out of the Neanderthal valley with a big gray wolf at his heels. Literature was born on the day when a boy came crying 'Wolf, wolf, wolf,' and there was no wolf behind him. That the poor little fellow, because he lied too often, was finally eaten up by a real beast is quite incidental. But here is what is important. Between the wolf in the tall grass and the wolf in the tall story, there is a shimmering go-between. That go-between, that prism, is the art of literature. We may put it this way," he goes on, "the magic of art was in the shadow of the wolf he deliberately invented, his dream of the wolf. Then the story of his tricks made a good story. When he perished at last, the story about him acquired a good lesson in the dark around the campfire. But he was the little magician." I have become aware in my travels as an author, as opposed to my travels as a writer, which all take place at my desk, that many readers are more interested in acquiring a good lesson from a serious novel than they are in participating in the magic of it, the magic of art. I suspect this is the reason that novelists are more often invited to give talks rather than to read from their work. There's a wonderful story about Eudora Welty, and I don't know if it's true, that she was invited by a local library to come and address their group. And Miss Welty asked the librarian, "Do you want me to read one of my stories?" And the librarian said, "No, we want you to speak to us in your own words." I also suspect that this is why the most frequent questions we hear begin with, "What did it mean that?" or end with, "Is that what you intended?" The wonder of the way a novel happens, of the simple miracle brought to you by that trinity of writer, narrator, reader, that miracle of seeing together what does not exist in the real world, seems less noteworthy to the contemporary reader than whatever it is the reader suspects the writer has to say, the writer's message, the novel's lesson, the hidden meaning behind each sentence. I have nothing against hidden meaning, or any kind of meaning. I have been known, in fact, to quote T.S. Eliot's lament to both my students and my children, "We had the experience but missed the meaning." But I would argue that the experience of the conjured world, how a novel happens, is primary. No meaning but in things, William Carlos Williams said of poetry. Archibald MacLeish ends his love poem, "Not marble nor the gilded monuments," with this: "I will not speak of the famous beauty of dead women. I will say the shape of a leaf lay once on your hair. Till the world ends and the eyes are out and the mouths broken, look, it is there." The wonder of the literary arts, of the way a novel happens, lies first and foremost for me in its ability to make us look together, writer, narrator, reader, to see together what is there. The writer's intention in pointing this out, his motivation for conjuring this particular world in that moment of seeing, is beside the point. If I have a pet peeve about the way novels are discussed, especially in middle school English classes or via those questions for your book club pamphlets that publishers are known to provide, it has to do with the whole "what about you" approach. Ishmael, the question might begin, had a very difficult boss in Captain Ahab. Have you ever had the experience of trying to work with a very difficult authority figure? Of course, the answer should always be yes. Yes, I have had the experience because I read the book. Because I read the book, I had the experience. I am Ishmael. My own real life and the experience in the real world has nothing to do with it. The life that is conjured when I lend my own interior voice, the voice with which I speak to myself, to Ishmael, and to Melville, is the only life that matters here. The experience of being part of that trinity is an end in itself for all three of us. So what then of the idea of the sacramental imagination, or better yet, as the phrase seems to imply, what of the sacramental imagination of the Catholic writer? Doesn't the very notion of a story told by an author with a sacramental imagination imply that the author begins with a conviction, a motive, in this case, that God reveals himself through the physical world, and then attempts to conjure just such a world by telling a story that upholds or illustrates this conviction? If the sacramental imagination is something that exists prior to the storytelling, if it is part of some conviction, some belief, then doesn't the motive for the story, like little Tony's attempt to disrupt his parents' lovemaking or the boy who cried wolf's attempt to alleviate his boredom, constitute its primary reason for being? Isn't the conjured world, the black snake in the sandy corner of the yard, the big gray wolf snapping at his heels, merely secondary, a cartoon that runs beside the editorial, a picture meant to convey an idea? In the early days of my career as a novelist, I allowed myself one motive, one goal for the fiction I would write. I would, as Joseph Conrad put it, seek to render the highest possible justice to the visible universe. Conrad said, "My task, which I am trying to achieve, is, by the power of the written word, to make you hear, to make you feel. It is, before all, to make you see. That and no more, and it is everything. Such a goal was everything for me by aesthetic choice. As a reader, I found no greater pleasure than the time I spent in the novel's conjured worlds. But it was also a choice I made by necessity. I would have to rely on the visible world in the stories I wrote because I had very few ideas beyond them. In short, I was pretty sure I had nothing in particular that I wanted my fiction to say, only perhaps, look, it is here. It is the motive I continue to serve 30 years on. Of course, I am not unique in this. I dare say Conrad's injunction operates to some degree in all of us who write literary fiction. Henry James talked about the goal of felt life. And here, for instance, is Flannery O'Connor, and you knew I'd have to bring Flannery O'Connor into the discussion sooner or later. She wrote, "I suppose when I say that the moral basis of poetry is the accurate naming of the things of God, I mean about the same thing that Conrad meant when he said that his aim as an artist was to render the highest possible justice to the visible universe." So, Flannery, Joe Conrad, and I, we all agree. I'm in pretty good company. But then Flannery goes on to say, "For me, the visible universe is a reflection of the invisible universe." She says St. Augustine wrote that the things of the world pour forth from God in a double way, intellectually into the minds of the angels and physically into the world of things. To the person who believes this, as the Western world did up until a few centuries ago, this physical, sensible world is good because it proceeds from a divine source. The artist penetrates the concrete world in order to find at its depths the image of its source, the image of ultimate reality. The visible universe is a reflection of the invisible universe. You would be hard-pressed to find a more succinct definition of the sacramental imagination. The artist penetrates the concrete world in order to find at its depths the image of its source, the image of ultimate reality. You would be hard-pressed, too, to find a more precise motive for Flannery O'Connor's fiction. But it is, alas, a motive she and I don't share. For as Flannery, with all the conviction of her great faith, forges ahead, penetrating the concrete world in order to find its divine source, I remain on the surface with Joseph Conrad, determined only to make you see, to use the power of the written word to create within that magical space formed by the trinity of writer, narrator, reader, something vivid and, for whatever time our three-person confluence lasts, real. Personally, I am in no way certain that the divine light shines through the things of this world, not with the kind of certainty that would sustain a 30-year career dedicated to demonstrating this through fiction. In my own experience, meaninglessness is often as good an explanation for the things of this world as is meaning. In matters of faith, I am as aware of wordplay and disingenuousness and outdated dogma as was my agnostic grad student, not to mention the role that fear and confusion, sentimentality and shallow thinking can play when we confront our most fervent hopes and deepest terrors. The Jesuit notion of God in all things is marvelous, but it takes a faith I don't have to keep another notion, one we call wishful thinking, from snapping at its heels. I am a born and bred Catholic, even a somewhat public Catholic, a practicing Catholic as well, although I sometimes joke when asked that yes, I am still a practicing Catholic, if practicing means still working at it, still not doing it very well, certainly not yet ready to take the stage. But I approach my faith with none of O'Connor's breathtaking certainty, probably not with the certainty of most of you in this room. But that personal, autobiographical stuff belongs to the real world. And as I've already pointed out, I have little worth saying about the real world. It is only the conjured world the universe made visible by the magic of art that interests me and compels me to write. And it is this conjured world, this world created through the written word and with no other motive than to make you see, that I find, much to my own surprise, that something of the invisible makes itself known. I don't mean this in a supernatural way, a fiery response to my prayer to the Holy Spirit. When I was a very young writer, I was on a panel with two other women writers. One was a rather august novelist with many books already published. The other was another first novelist. And when the Q&A came, the first question was, where do you get your ideas from? And the august novelist leaned forward immediately and said, the Holy Spirit. And the other first novelist right next to me leaned forward right after that and said, me too. And I thought, I am in the wrong profession. Working steadily at words, my nose pressed to the page, so to speak, I find that meaning, perhaps even some glimmer of ultimate reality, exists in the things of this created world, not because I placed it there, but because the very effort to see, the labor of working at words, reveals it. To put it more succinctly, as a less than ardent Catholic, I do not bring a sacramental imagination to my work. I discover the sacramental while struggling merely to describe. Here's O'Connor again. It is generally supposed, and not least by Catholics, that the Catholic who writes fiction is out to prove the truth of his faith, or at the least, to prove the existence of the supernatural. What the fiction writer will discover, if he discovers anything at all, is that he himself cannot move or mold reality in the interest of abstract truth. The writer learns, perhaps more quickly than the reader, to be humble in the face of what is. What is all he has to do with. The concrete is his medium, and he will realize eventually that fiction can transcend its limitations only by staying within them. Which brings me to the other part of this little talk, one generously offered by Eric Goldschmidt, who invited me here, and that is the astonished by love part. You have to understand, although I am a contemporary woman of the 21st century, I was raised by first-generation Irish Catholics in the 20th. So when I was invited to talk about intimacy and relations, I said, yes, great idea. And then I said to myself, you can't do that. So I thought maybe this would be a good time to let my fiction speak to itself. Astonished by love. Here's the passage early in Someone in which that phrase appears. And if you listen to it, perhaps you can glimpse how the effort to see precedes anything else that might be going on in these lines. From the far corner, the neighborhood's men and working women were coming home. Everyone wore hats. Everyone wore trim, dark shoes, which was where my eyes fell when any of them said, "Hello, Marie," passing by. At 7, I was a shy child and comical-looking, with a round, flat face and black slits for eyes, thick glasses, black bangs, a straight and serious mouth, a little girl cartoon, with my heart pinned to my father's sleeve in those days. The boys were playing stickball down the street, always at this time of the day, some of them friends of Gabe, my brother, although he, young scholar, remained inside at his books. The younger boys were lined at the curb watching the game, Walter Hartnett among them. He had his cap turned backward and the leg with the built-up shoe extended before him. Blind Bill Corrigan, who had been gassed in the war, was on the sidewalk just behind Walter, sitting in the painted kitchen chair that his mother set out for him every morning when the weather was fine. Bill Corrigan wore a business suit and polished shoes, and although there was a glitch in the skin around his eyes, a scarred shine in the satiny folds of his eyelids, although he was brought to the kitchen chair every afternoon when the weather was fine by his mother, whose arm he held the way a bride holds the arm of a groom. It was to him that the boys in the street appealed whenever a drop ball or an untimely tag sent both teams howling and cawing to his side of the street. They were there now, shouting into one another's faces, throwing their caps on the ground, and begging Bill Corrigan to make the call. He raised one of his big, pale hands, and suddenly half the boys spun around, the other half cheered. Walter Hartnett rocked backward in despair, raising his good foot in the air. I pushed my glasses back on my nose. Small city birds, the color of ashes, rose and fell along the rooftops. In the fading evening light, the stoop beneath my thighs, as warm as breath when I first sat down, now exhaled a shallow chill. Mr. Shahab walked by with a brown bag from the bakery in his hand. He had his white apron balled up beneath his arm, the ties trailing. There was the scent of new baked bread as he passed. Big Lucy, a girl I feared, pushed a scooter along the opposite sidewalk. Two sisters of charity from the convent down the street passed by, smiling from inside their bonnets. I turned my head to watch their backs, wondering always why their long hems never caught at their heels. At the end of the block, the sisters paused to greet a heavy woman with thick, pale legs and a dark apron under her coat. She said something to them that made them nod. Then the three turned the corner together. The game paused again, and the boys parted reluctantly as a black car drove by. I shivered and waited. Little Marie, sole survivor now of that street scene, waited for the first sighting of my father coming up from the subway in his hat and coat, most beloved among all those ghosts. My father appeared at the corner, paused for his evening paper, top coat and hat to mark him as a clerk, not a laborer. I only raised my head above my knees when I saw him, although surely something, some sinewy energy, some delight, tensed and trembled itself through my thin back and shoulders as I gazed down the sloping street. The boys playing stickball parted once again for a passing car. It was the ebb and flow of their game. I turned away from them, raised a hand to the balustrade to get ready to spring. My father was a thin, slight man in a long coat. His step was quick and jaunty. He, too, wore shoes with a high shine. I waited until he was halfway toward home, and then I flew across the sidewalk and into the air as he lifted me, the newspaper held tightly under his arm, the only impediment, it seemed, to an ascent that I saw in my own imagination as equivalent somehow to the caps the boys had thrown into the air when Bill Corrigan made his call. I would not have been surprised to hear them cheer. My father smelled always of fresh newsprint and cigarettes, of the alcohol in his faded cologne. I caught my chin on his buttons as he lowered me to the ground, a brief, painful scrape that upset my glasses and made my eyes water. I walked the last few paces home, balanced on his shoes. We climbed the steps together and into the fragrant vestibule, fragrant with the onion odor of cooked dinners and the brownstone scent of old wood, and up the narrow stairs and into the apartment where my mother was in the kitchen and my brother at the dining room table with his books. The apartment we lived in was long and narrow, with windows in the front and in the back. The back caught the morning light, and the front the slow orange hours of the afternoon and evening. Even at this cool hour in late spring, it was a dusty city light. It fell on paint-polished window seats and pink carpet roses. It stamped the looming plaster walls with shadowed crossbars, long rectangles. It fit itself through the bedroom door, crossed the living room, climbed the sturdy legs of the formidable dining room chairs, and was laid out now on the dining room table where the cloth, Starched linen, expertly decorated with my mother's meticulous cross-stitch, had been carefully folded back along the whole length so that Gabe could place his school blotter and his books on the smooth wood. It was the first light my poor eyes ever knew. Recalling it, I sometimes wonder if all the faith and all the fancy, all the fear, the speculation, all the wild imaginings that go into the study of heaven and hell don't shortchange, after all, that other, earlier uncertainty, the darkness before the slow coming to awareness of the first light. Slipping out of that first darkness into the dusty city light of these rooms, I met the blurred faces of the parents I had been given through no merit of my own, faces that even to my defective eyes, ill-formed, you might say, in the hours of that first darkness, were astonished by love. So that's the first place the phrase appears. And it kept coming back, and it came back in ways that astonished me as well. When Marie is married, years later, briefly, this is her experience. So I had my wedding in the pretty church after all. Squinting at myself in the narrow bathroom mirror, lovely in my makeup and my veil, I confessed to another time. How's that, Mr. Hartnett, I thought, Mr. Walter Hartnett. Gabe walked me down the aisle and surprised me at the last minute by not merely kissing my cheek when we reached Tom, but pulling me into a firm embrace. We all joked about it later at the reception. Like he was sending you off to the Foreign Legion, Tom said. Gabe laughed quietly, admitted, blushing, that he might have been a little overcome. There was so much to think about on such a day. I am the fool of loss, Gabe said. You haven't lost a sister, Tom told him. You've gained me. God help you. That night, Tom lifted the blanket and I closed my eyes completely, even though the light in the hotel room was already dim, only a thin shaft from along the bathroom door and the low glow of streetlight behind the thick curtains. There's not much to you, is there? He said. I was on my back, my hands folded together over my chest so that I was aware of both the new wedding ring on one and the feel of my own heartbeat beneath the other. I wore the white nightgown, satin, and lace that my mother had sewn. It was the centerpiece of my trousseau, and the provocative way my mother had worked the lovely lace into its bodice had come as some surprise to me. My mother, it seemed, knew things she had never spoken of. Take it or leave it, I told Tom with a laugh. I was dizzy with the champagne we had drunk. And Tom said, "Oh, I'll take it, if I may." There was the stirring touch of alcohol on his breath, the taste of champagne and sweet cake at the back of my throat, the faint, lingering scent of bleach on the hotel sheets and pillowcases. And it was either an indication of some expertise I didn't know he had, or of my mother's skill with fabric and needle and thread, that I was out of the lovely nightgown without the slightest effort on my part, without even opening my eyes. I was naive enough, drunk enough, to be surprised to find that a body could be a new thing altogether, shed of its clothes. Just as I was surprised to discover, not then, of course, but over time, that in the dark it would all remain unchanged. Skin, hair, and limb, bone and blubber, scent and heartbeat and rhythm of breath, unchanged as far as mouth was concerned, lips were concerned, a mystery revealed only to the long married. And that same astonishment, as I was just trying to see this one unremarkable woman's life, and to get it into that conjured world, She has her first child and nearly dies in childbirth. And she is told by everyone, the priest, her mother, her doctor, her husband, not to have another child. As she begins to recover, she goes back to her apartment with her husband. At the apartment in Rego Park, all was spick and span and lemon polish and the lingering odor of the apple pie Tom had taught himself to bake that morning, only the beginning of his efforts to make up for a wife who would not learn. There were roses in a vase on the table in the small kitchen, the crib was ready in the single bedroom, and our bed was crisply made. He carried up the bassinet and the bottles and the shopping bag of food while I changed the baby's diaper and fed him a bottle and put him in his crib. Then Tom made tea and cut 2 pieces of the pie. I admired the roses while we ate at the small table. Tom told a funny story about the 2 ladies in the grocery store who had advised him about the best apples to choose. While the baby's asleep, I told him, I might go lie down. He brought my suitcase in, and I changed out of my dress and took off my stockings and put a housecoat over my slip. I put my glasses on the bedside table. He smoothed down the bedspread for me and took a throw from the closet all wordlessly, so as not to wake the sleeping child. He lowered the shades while I stretched out on the bed, and when he leaned down to kiss my forehead and whisper sweet dreams, I took his wrist and said, You lie down too. He walked around the bed, sat at the edge, and untied his shoes. He lay back somewhat cautiously, I thought, and with as much distance between us as there could be in a double bed, reached over and took my hand. He gripped it briefly to assure himself that I was there perhaps, or maybe simply to convey that he was grateful for the assurance. I heard him sigh and knew without turning my head he had closed his eyes. I lifted his hand and brought it to my lips. It was not that my life was less valuable to me now that I had glimpsed what it would be like to lose it. My love for the child asleep in the crib, the child's need for me, for my vigilance, had made my life valuable in a way that even the most abundantly offered love, my parents, my brothers, even Tom's, had failed to do. Love was required of me now, to be given, not merely to be sought and returned. And even the certainty of that fact seemed reason to throw away caution, not to heed it. I kissed his hand and moved it to my heart. We turned to each other. Oh, Marie, he whispered, we have to be careful. Why? I asked. And I saw that he couldn't resist a smile at my answer. I was a bold piece. He made his eyes and his mouth grow serious. You can't endure another child. Who said? I whispered. He shook his head. I still held his hand against my heart. Your doctor, he said, your brother, even the priest who came to the hospital, who gave you last rites. Fools, I said. Which one of them has ever had a baby? But Tom closed his eyes and put his hand to his forehead. What a terrible night that was, he said. He whispered, they gave you last rites, as if the memory of it still took his breath away. Gently, I touched his cheek to make him see me. I squinted in an effort to see him. It was only the silly infection, I said, and moved closer. I felt the ache in my abdomen, the muscles closing up around the ragged scar. Next time I'll know better, I said. I'll bring my own ether. I began to unbutton his shirt. Everyone says the second baby's easier. Put my lips to his bared throat. Was there any place on a body more lonely and vulnerable? A girl next time, I said. One of the nurses told me to have a girl next time, someone to take care of me in my old age, but he was still shaking his head. I'm not afraid, I told him. I wasn't. I had conceived our first child without any notion of the suffering involved. Now that I knew, desire, which was still there, of course, seemed small enough incentive to conceive again. It was courage now that was delightful to me. I was a bold piece. I had stood at death's door. I had withstood pain. I knew I could make a stand against it, against time. Bold and stubborn, a living child in my arms. When he ran his fingertips over the scar that split my belly, he paused. I heard him catch his breath. "This is foolish of us," he whispered. I said, "I suppose it is." Back to the stuff at hand. That it should happen, in my effort to describe, to make you see, that I discover, as my narrator discovers, as my reader discovers, that love is redemptive, that it is a mystery that outruns time, physical change, mortality, much as our Christian faith tells us it does. Well, I'm as astonished at this as you are, as she is. This is not a message or a meeting I set out to discover or to illustrate or to confirm. It's simply what happened, what happens when through the magic of art, through the grace of that holy trinity of writer, narrator, reader, a world is conjured via the written word, a world where the concrete shimmers with the light of the unseen, where life conquers death, where love redeems us. Is that what you intended to say, the chattering classes well may ask? As a practicing Catholic, do you think this is true? That the divine light shows itself through the ordinary objects of our everyday existence? Is that what you're trying to prove? I repeat my disclaimer. I set out to prove nothing. I know nothing about the real world. I cannot speak with certainty about what God does or does not do in it. But as one part of that holy trinity that constitutes the necessary and silent confluence of minds that transforms marks on a page into a world, I can point to what we see together in all its vividness and clarity and say, as astonished as narrator and reader alike, astonished by love, by grace, by God in all things, look, it is there. Thank you.
And we invite your questions or comments. And just ask that you wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you.
I'd like your comments as a writer on the concept of inspiration, not divine inspiration, just inspiration.
Well, we can hope it's divine. Well, I mean, I think that's, there's something else that Flannery O'Connor says about that if you talk about the supernatural these days, and she was saying it back then, people think you're nuts, or people are embarrassed by it. I think that's the word she used. People are embarrassed by it. And I am too. But I guess, I do feel that there is something else involved in the way art comes to us. And it can't just be about the artist, and it can't just be about whoever receives it. I count all the arts, music and painting, and the written word as well. There's something remarkable, and you can say it's inspiration, but then you have spirit, and then you have breath, and then we're right back to Christianity again. But I do believe it's a gift. There is a gift, and I'm not sure of its source, but I am amazed at its complexity and beauty.
I live in a brownstone in South Boston, and the way you described the light coming through is exactly the way it drifts into our apartment, our house. And we had that same table when we were children, with the linen rolled back, and 7 of us doing our homework on it.
That's the wonderful thing about reading in Boston or New York. Everybody's had the same life.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is my sister.
Don't you? I've read several of your novels. That's why I'm here.
Oh, thank you.
And I'll shop before I go home. I wondered, don't you feel, even though you're saying you don't see the Catholicism or the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, don't you find that in your characters, in their values, and in their love, which of course charity, and mercy, like in Charming Billy, that is coming through the light?
Oh, sure. I mean, I write about characters of faith. I write about Catholic characters. And again, to paraphrase Flannery, not to prove anything, not to get anybody back into the church,
Yeah.
Or to drive anybody from it either. I think both intentions would be disruptive to the story, to the art of it. And I have to say, I was about to say initially, but I think continually, I use these characters, and I'm interested in these characters. Number one, because it's easy, because I know how they speak. I know their customs, I know their rituals, I know those tables. And hey, that's material at hand. Also, I understand that I'm interested in characters who are not particularly articulate about their inner lives. They have them. One of the reasons I wanted to write this novel and give it over entirely to the single voice of this very unremarkable woman was because I wanted attention to be paid to that complex interior life that she has, even though on the surface she could easily be dismissed as someone we should pay no attention to. And since I'm interested in the interior life, I find that writing about Catholic characters gives them metaphor and language for that interior life that they would not believably have themselves. So that's also handy. But I never set out, as I say, to prove anything about the church. And I think if I had discovered something that showed that these people were deluded or wrong in the way they use the language of the church to express their aspirations, to make sense of their worlds. If I had discovered that they were wrong, I would be the first to admit that and to put it in the story. What I discovered as a writer was the truth of it to their lives. As a writer, what I'm looking for is the shapeliness of the story. I'm looking for every word to count. I'm looking for meaning in every detail I choose. If not, then why make this stuff up? Why not just write about what's there? The freedom that the fiction writer has is if you say it's red, it's red. If you say change that, it's yellow, it's yellow. You're making this stuff up. So what I was interested in just as an artist, not as a Catholic artist, but just as an artist, is a sense of connectedness, a sense of shapeliness in the stories that I tell. And while I was busy pursuing that, I began to see how deeply and how true the metaphors of the church and the language of the church was to the experience. And I began to discover connections in these experiences that I had not looked for, that made me think there's something else here that I don't think I quite grasp yet, but it's there. so in some ways, the handiness of Catholicism, all of us who are raised in Catholic schools who become writers, we all have to either dispense with our Catholic upbringing or go back to it. Catholicism gave me my language, it gave me my sense of story, it gave me a sense of the value of reenactment, which in many ways storytelling is akin to. But putting all that aside, I discovered something I hadn't expected to discover just by wanting to create a well-done piece of art.
If I may just add one thing, I don't really think it's the artist's job to make a point. So, and I think you covered that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a member of the chattering classes, teacher at BC, and I'm very interested in your trinity and particularly the movement from writer to narrator, especially when the narrator is a character, which is adds another kind of person to all of that. And while listening to your passages, I was struck, as the chattering classes always say, I was struck by, and also thinking about your Trinity, I was struck by the way in which it seems as though in the passages you read, the greatest act of imagination, or the primary act of imagination that your writer has to engage in is kind of pulling down the shades so that you can start in the darkness of not knowing any of the things you've discovered over these 30 years and more, so that you can start all over again as a narrator, trying to see, so that you can get out of the way the things you've already seen as a person in the world. Is that something that is part of what you think you're doing?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that and it's a struggle, that all the things that you have to put aside. It sounds glib to say, well, as a writer, you put yourself at the service of the character, but that is not as easy as it sounds. As the writer, you've got your ego and you've got your life, and keeping that away from the piece itself, from this thing that will only exist when the three of us get together, and that world is conjured. I'm often telling my students, and it just came back to me just now, hearing your lovely point about pulling down the shades, what Seamus Heaney says. He says it to young poets, but fiction writers we can sometimes sort of eavesdrop on what the poets are saying about language. But he says that poets must teach themselves to walk on air against our better judgment. And I think there's that sense of approaching a story and not knowing, approaching in darkness and not understanding the voice and not having a point to make, and not thinking about anything you've ever written before or anything that you may write later, or who's going to like this and who's not going to like this, and are they going to pushing all of that away, and stepping into the void, and beginning with language, beginning with the sound of the sentence, the rhythm of the first language, the images that are evoked through the words, and then to begin to hope that those images contain within them story and connectedness and something you didn't know you were after. Margaret Atwood, I don't have to just always quote Irishman. Margaret Atwood says that art is the third rabbit you pull out of the hat, the one you didn't put in there. So there's that sense of dispensing with ego, dispensing with intention, and in the beginning is the words. Starting with the language and the beauty of it, and listening to it, and then seeing what that evokes. And how that might reveal story.
Thanks. Hi, I may be reaching with this question, but behind you is that backdrop of the church in the 21st century. And just hearing you talk about pulling the rabbit out of the hat that was not put there may short circuit this question, but I'll try it anyway. If you're lucky enough to have not just grandchildren but great grandchildren, and one of those children wants to have a career following in their luminous ancestor, writing about fiction with Catholic characters, if I may put it that way, what do you think they may be writing about? 40, 60, 50, 60 years in the future? Or is this pulling the rabbit out that wasn't put in there the answer to your question that you can't project? In other words, where is the church going, and does that in some sense reflect how fiction writers who focus to some degree on unbelievers pick their topics and stories?
Wow, yeah. Well, I can first talk about my real world experience because I can't predict, and I don't know. And if I had a great grandchild who said, "Great grandma, I want to write a novel about Catholics," I'd say, cut that sentence off after novel, and go start writing, and then come back to me, and then find out if you've written about Catholics or not. That much I'm pretty sure will remain true into the 21st century. I have discovered from my experience as a public Catholic just this past year that things are getting better for us. I thank Pope Francis for this. I have been interviewed over the past couple of decades as a public Catholic, and I have seen on many an occasion the chattering classes, the interviewers sit back when they ask, and are you still a practicing Catholic? And I said yes. And usually they would sit back and then want to get on to another topic very quickly. The discomfort that saying, I'm identifying with the Catholic Church, we're not perfect, but I'm not here to apologize for it. I believe there's much value in it. The discomfort that used to cause is not as great as it used to be. And I think maybe something as simple, because we are a simple-minded culture, of having the Pope on the cover of Rolling Stone has made it okay again to bring up Catholicism. I mean, it still makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it's there. So maybe not into the next century, but maybe in the next few decades, young writers will just be able to more comfortably talk about faith, or at least address without irony or cruelty characters who have faith. I don't think we're there yet. The evidence that I can see from my own students is that they're still very afraid of it, and most of the religious characters who appear in most of the fiction I read by young writers is again, it's either ironic, or they're diluted, or it's used for some other, but they're not fully taken seriously. But there's a kind of generalized dispassion among the young writers of the millennial generation that I've observed, and I don't blame them for that. I think there's many reasons for it. Part of it is that this is a generation that is so careerist that they're afraid to make mistakes, and they're afraid to write about the wrong things, and they're not going to their writing driven so much by passion. It may have happened at some point, maybe when they were in 6th grade, but then their parents, and that's my generation, swooped in and sent them to writing camp, and signed them up for AP courses, and got them to meet the poet who lives down the street, and so they forgot what it was that already now they're on a career track to be writers, and they've forgotten whatever bit of passion or attempt, again, just to that insistence that I write, that insistence that I make the world visible through the word. They've lost it because it was just as they were grabbing it, it was somehow taken away from them. There's something to be said, I can say now, looking back. I didn't enjoy it at the time, but there's something to be said for having the people close to you put as many obstacles in the way of your being an artist as they possibly can. A little friction early on does great things for the young artist. And this is a generation that hasn't had much friction as far as anything they've ever wanted to do. I think it'll come back. But I think that shows up in what they're writing about. They're very cautious, lots of irony, a bit of distance, not that kind of passionate, sloppy writing that I was accustomed to seeing when I was an undergrad.
We have time for one more comment, question.
First of all, as one part of the Trinity, I'd like to say that I think you hold up your side very well.
Thank you.
And that was a beautiful reading.
Thank you.
But thinking also about your sharing with Joseph Conrad the desire to do justice to the physical world, I'm having trouble imagining him writing about Marie and you writing Heart of Darkness. And can you talk about the kind of intention or point of view or subjectivity that also speaks to writing?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the wonder and beauty of it is each one of us has that subject that no one else can write, and that voice that is ours alone. Even if we agree, Flannery and Henry James and Joe and I, that we're out to do justice to the visible world. Every novel is different. But I was very aware with someone that I wanted to make the attempt to give an entire novel over to this voice, to this character. Part of it was that I understood that she was a character, a woman coming of age over the course of the 20th century, the child of immigrants, working to middle class all her life, not particularly physically attractive, not particularly intelligent, ordinary in all those respects. A woman who would not much have been asked her opinion. Not a lot of attention would have been paid in her own life. And I saw that character, and this is my mother's generation. I know lots of women from that generation who would fit that larger profile. Worked a little bit, went to high school, worked a little bit, moved out to the suburbs. It all worked out. That's what they wanted. And yet each and every one of them with an interior life that is very distinct, and a way of looking at the world and the way of reacting to the things that happen to them very distinct. And I became aware of that about at the same time as a teacher and as a reader. I became aware of how little contemporary fiction, even literary serious fiction, was given over to a female's voice. I was finding it not only in the books that I read. I'm not saying there aren't lots of wonderful women writers. It's a heyday. We've got the best writing that's coming out of this country and probably around the world is being done by women. But so much of it is from a male point of view, or if there is a female point of view, it's also folded in with a male point of view. But just that sense that when was the last time I read a book that was entirely given over to a woman, her life, her experience, no other chapters, nothing from her husband, nothing. And I also was seeing as a teacher that a lot of my young women writers were writing in a male voice. Nothing wrong with that. As artists, we should be able to write in whatever voice we want to. The family dog, a boy, a girl, whatever. But when I started to ask, especially my younger 20-something women writers, why 3 stories now, and they're all from, the point of view, one an old man, one an adolescent man, And what I was hearing from them was, I don't want people to think I'm writing chick lit. I want to be taken seriously. And I thought, 21st century, really? So those two things. So on the one hand, it was the character herself. and the complexity of that, to capture that interior life. And the other was one of those motives that, in some ways, once I started writing, I had to lock out of the room, and that is what's going on in the real world and what's going on in the world of literature. But it was a motive that anytime my courage failed me as I was writing this book, and it did many times when I thought, her husband was a prisoner of war at the Baltic. If I wrote a few scenes from that prisoner of war camp, from his point of view, he fell out of a plane, number one, the men are going to love this, and then I can do anything. She's got a brother who was a priest, and then he wasn't a priest, and he's intellectual, and he quotes poetry. It'd be so much more. I was feeling constrained by the limitations of Marie's experience. Why don't I just knock out a couple of chapters from his point of view? And that's where the sort of motive that was waiting outside the door would have to come in and say, no, stay with this. And as a matter of fact, just as a matter of craft, and I've never done this in 7 novels and I don't know how many other pieces of fiction, I wrote almost the entire novel in the third person. And something just I wasn't happy with it. I even published an excerpt before the book was finished, and it was in the third person. And something nagged at me. And slowly I began to realize that the difference between writing I sat on the stoop and she sat on the stoop was that an author had intervened. That I was just still uncomfortable enough with giving over an entire novel to this not extraordinary woman, that the finesse of third person reflected my talent and not her heart. And I had to go back. This is when I say you put yourself at the service of the character and say, this isn't about me. It's about this world and this character. And I had to go back and give her the I to tell her own and give her that much respect. So that's how motive can kind of wend its way. It's never completely, as much as we'd like to think, it's never completely barred from the room. Can wend its way into changing how the story is told.
Can you all join me in thanking Alice McDermott? And thank you, Paul Mariani, for your beautiful introduction. And you both certainly take ordinary words and ordinary characters and show us an extraordinary world, and you invite us into a sacred place. Thank you for that.